Hello, everyone. So we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution. Um, this was a time when technologies started to advance and cities started to be built and form and factories. And there was a lot of change from how they were working and living in small towns. And now moving into bigger cities and in factories and things like that. So we're going to talk about that right now, and then you're going to complete a true and false assignment after this. Okay. All right. So, what was the Industrial Revolution? Basically, the Industrial Revolution was a time when the manufacturing of goods, so making products, moved from small shops and homes to large factories. People moved from rural areas, which just means areas that don't have a lot of people or buildings and things like that. So they moved from that type of an area to big cities to find work. It also introduced new technologies, new types of transportation, and a different way of life. So this was a big change from the way people were living to sort of the way we kind of live now. It sort of introduced us to these factories, big cities, and these technologies that we still have today. Okay, so there were two phases to this. The first phase was called First Industrial Revolution. So that was in the late 1700s to the mid 1800s. And what it did is it began the move of production from homes to factories. So that's when they started making things. Instead of making them at home, they started making them in factories. Steam power and the cotton gin were important innovations during this phase. So those were some important inventions and innovations that were created during that time period. Then the second industrial revolution happened in the mid 1800s to about the early 1900s. This is when large factories and companies began to use more technologies to mass produce products. Basically, what mass produce means is to make a lot of things at one time in a short amount of time. Okay. Important innovations included electricity, the production line, and the Bessemer steel process. All right, so some cultural changes. So before the revolution, most people lived in the country and worked on farms. During the revolution, those people they started moving to the cities and they worked in factories. So they were living out in this rural area in the country where there wasn't a lot of people and buildings and they worked on their farms, and now they're starting to move to cities and work in factories. What ended up happening is the cities grew, but they became overcrowded and polluted. So there was too many people. A lot of people were polluting. In many ways, in many cities, poor workers lived in crowded and unsafe buildings. So as this was happening, more and more people moving into the city, and it was becoming very crowded. It was becoming polluted, and these buildings that they were living in were not safe to be living in. Transportation. So transportation changed dramatically throughout the Industrial Revolution. Where before people traveled by horse, walking, or boat, the new ways of travel were introduced included railroads, steamboats, and automobiles. So basically, during this time, people started using less horses and boats and walking, and instead they started now were introduced to these things like railroads and steamboats. Steamboats is just was a boat that was powered by steam, probably made it move faster and was more efficient, and cars were invented at this point, or at least starting to be introduced. So this changed the way people and products were able to travel around the country and the world. So working conditions was a big problem, and as you could see, there's pictures of these children here in these factories, and these are young children, probably about your age. I would say 8, 9, 10 years old, and they were forced to work during this time. This was before laws. So it says one drawback of the Industrial Revolution was poor working conditions for people in factories. There were few laws to protect workers at the time, so there was not a lot of laws that protected people's safety while they worked. And working conditions were dangerous. People often had to work long hours, and child labor was common. So adults and children. Children weren't allowed to even go to school, some of them, because they needed to go work. They needed to work for their families, and there were no laws against this. So these very, very young children would have to go and work these long hours, and it was not a safe place for these children or even the adults to be. But by the end of the 1900s, labor unions and new laws began to create a safer work environment. So basically, people were coming together and saying, hey, this isn't okay. We're working 18-hour shifts. Children are getting injured. People are getting hurt. Some people were losing arms and fingers because the machines were so unsafe and there was nothing to oversee it and regulate it. So it was a huge, huge problem. So while this was a disadvantage to the Industrial Revolution, they fixed it over time and they did make it better, but the Industrial Revolution gave us so much and so many inventions and technologies that we still use today. So it was an important part of history. All right, so that's it. I know that was a brief lesson, but go ahead and do the assignment in Teams. It's a true or false assignment. And if you have any questions, just let us know. Thank you. Bye.